I hope everyone's doing well. Tonight we will continue our study in the book of Revelation. We're going to begin again in Revelation chapter 21, and then we'll jump to 22. We won't cover everything in the chapters, but there's a few pieces that I think will be helpful for thinking about what is heaven and earth like, and all the imagery that is utilized in these chapters are beautiful, but I think it's saying something more than just, hey, we get to go to this place, but rather talking about the transformation of the world through the presence of God in the person of Jesus. And so we started reading Revelation 21 last week, and I want to pick up in verse 9 and read through verse 14. We'll skip over 15 through 21. I'll just have a brief comment on that, and then we'll jump back into 22, verse 22, and then read through chapter 22 for the very first part of it as well. So let's begin with verse 9. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." And he carried me away in the spirit to a mountain great and high, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. It shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, and with 12 angels at the gates. On the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. And there were 3 gates on the east, 3 on the north, 3 on the south, and 3 on the west. The wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Now skipping down to verse 22. I did not see a temple in the city, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and the Lamb is its lamp. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor to it. On no day will its gates ever be shut, for there will be no night there. The glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it. Nothing impure will ever enter it, nor will anyone who does what is shameful or deceitful, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. So I want to stop there for just a minute and go back to verse 9 to talk a little bit about what's happening with John, the Revelator, in this particular story. So as we had mentioned, there is this initial imagery in the beginning of chapter 21 of this marriage ceremony that's going on, a marriage banquet between heaven and earth. And it being brought into union, humanity and God, creation, all being caught up in the life of God. And this image continues on in verse 9, where there goes to be a little bit more imagery and explanation and description, picture making of what this new Jerusalem looks like as the bride of the Lamb. So we have one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls that appears and tells John, "Come with me and I'll show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." The bride being God's people over time, and the church essentially as well. But God's people over time being brought into this particular union with the Lamb as a marriage ceremony, as a wedding. And so the Spirit carries John away to a mountain great and high, and showed him the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. Now, if you remember in the Gospels, Jesus is actually taken by Satan to a high point up on the temple and given this sort of survey of all the kingdoms of the world. And of course, Satan tempts Jesus, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down off this Temple Mount and the angels will save you, and then everybody will follow you," of course. So there's this kind of parallel imagery being utilized for John being taken up on the high point of the city of Jerusalem and being shown the city and it coming down out of heaven from God. We get the sense that he is not only surveying Jerusalem, but also surveying all the nations. He's surveying everything that's happening in the world, and in particular through the lens of what's happening with Jerusalem as heaven and earth are being brought into this sort of marriage. He says about the city of Jerusalem in particular that it shone with the glory of God, which is to say God's presence was manifested in that place. If you remember, Isaiah talks about the train of God's robe filling the temple, and he being sort of awestruck by the presence of God. Well, that language, the word glory there is kavod, and it is a word that in Hebrew means sort of a weightiness. Glory is heavy, it's intense, and so it's always marked, this sense of glory, with a mark of God's presence and the sheer holiness of God. And so John is experiencing this moment, being on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and surveying not only Jerusalem but the world, and seeing this marriage ceremony happening, and recognizing that God's presence is right there in the midst of it, in this union, this communion between creation and God and humanity, all being brought together in this fellowship. And so he says that the whole city shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel. And so he begins to talk about it being like jasper and clear as crystal. And he talks about these gates and walls, and there's 12 of them. So on each side of the city, there's 3 walls and 3 gates on each side. And they have a different stone that's part of all this makeup, and just a sheer kind of picture of beauty and translucence and glory that's written in all of this. And it's not a picture of what exactly this will be. It's not like this is a building of concrete. For it's talking about the gates being written with the 12 names of the tribes of Israel, and the foundations also being the 12 apostles. So this is also kind of carrying on this imagery that the faithful witness of God's people over time are going to bring about this this reality of God's presence, that all of that they have testified to is sort of being brought into this moment of realization where God and humanity are dwelling together and brought into this beautiful sense of communion and shared fellowship. So he talks again about the walls, the foundations, the 12 apostles and the 12 disciples and the 12 tribes. That all of this is really essentially the people of God that are part of this wedding ceremony. They are the bride. And then he goes on in verses 15 through 21 to describe the perfect dimensions, and again, sort of the beauty of this, the measurements and the jewels that are all sort of part of this foundation and wall and everything. But what's really interesting is that once he's sort of talked about these walls and gates and everything like that, once he's sort of given this description, he goes a little bit further inside and looks for the temple, which you would expect to be in Jerusalem. The temple was a significant marker of God's presence for Israel. It was a place of worship. It was a place where what they would say maybe is like a thin place, where heaven is so close and so near. It's the holiness of God is palpable. And so you would anticipate, as a good Jewish person, that in Jerusalem, where God's presence was supposed to be at, the temple would be there. But to his shock, there is no temple. There's no need for the temple. There's no longer that division between heaven and earth. There's no longer the curtain that has sort of closed off the most holy of places from everybody else, except for the high priest once a year. Instead, the temple has been replaced fundamentally. It's no longer needed, and because God and the Lamb are ever present as the living temple. In fact, if you remember Jesus talking about, you will destroy this temple, but I will raise it in 3 days, the temple being his body. So there's already this sort of imagery and language that's utilized in the Gospels for talking about in the person of Jesus is the meeting ground between God and humanity, where humanity and God are brought together in fullness. And holiness is shared in that kind of way. There is this transformation, this making holy of humanity through the person of Jesus, so that communion can be a part of life. Communion between God and humanity is no longer at this crazy distance, but always with this sense of intimacy and being personal. But at the same time, it's also being brought together in community, not just as individuals, but as a community, a family, or the church and God's people over time. So the temple is not needed because God's presence is there and available and made free. And it also says that the city doesn't even need sun or moon to shine on it, and the glory of God gives the city light, and the Lamb is its lamp. In other words, God is the one who continues to lead the city, lead the people. Everything is sort of oriented and ordered by the life of God, and God gives light to the whole city. There is no place for darkness. There is no place for the hidden places in the world where people are trampled underfoot and mistreated and abused and so on and so forth. Rather, the presence of God illuminates the entire world and gives light and a sense of order and rightness to the creation. And it goes even further. So this sort of spills out, not only from Jerusalem, but spills out to the rest of creation. The nations will walk by its light. The kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. And on no day will its gates ever be shut. I've heard a few times here and there that some people talk about the gates of heaven and them being closed, and they've even used that as justification for talking about closing borders and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is that's not the image that is given in the book of Revelation. These gates are constantly open. There's this accessibility. There's not a closed offness. There's this ability to come in and out. And there's not a sense of needing to protect or hold on to or secure, but rather flowing to and from the city of God is all of humanity, all of creation, all of the nations, that they are part of this life for the fullness of all creation. And so the gates are never shut, and there's never any night. And the glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it. Nothing impure will ever enter it, nor will there be anyone who does what is shameful or deceitful, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. So there's this deep sense that the world has been reordered. It has been made right, and not only between God and the creatures and creation, but between humanity itself. There is no longer need for warfare, bloodshed, violence, no sort of suspicion between peoples. Rather, all nations are a reflection of the diversity that is already present in God. God who is both one and three, who is both unity, but also diversity, unity and diversity, diversity and unity, all those kinds of things. So the diversity of creation is actually a reflection of the very diversity that is the life of God, shared in this mutual communion between Father, Spirit, and Son that is overflowing in love to the rest of creation, and that then the creation returns to God by love of neighbor, by this sort of mutuality of the neighbor. So there's, again, this just sort of beautiful imagery of this wedding ceremony that is everybody's sort of caught up in this joyous occasion, this joyous event of the restoration of all things. And then we go just a little bit further into Revelation 22. I'll read that, and we'll read verses 1 through 5. And it says, "Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. There will be no more night. They will not need the light of a lamp or the light of the sun, for the Lord will give them light, and they will reign forever and ever." So the first image that we get is the angel shows John this river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, not polluted, but beautiful and flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb down the middle of the great street of the city. Now, John is using imagery from the book of Ezekiel. And in that particular passage out of Ezekiel, it talks about this water that is flowing from the throne of God out into the creation, down into the Dead Sea. And as the water goes, it becomes deeper and wider and deeper and wider. And as it flows into the Dead Sea, where nothing can live, it's just a salt heap, nasty water. It's sort of the epitome of death in so many ways. this water that flows from the throne transforms that Dead Sea into a life-filled place where all of creation thrives because the life of God has flown into the dead places of the world. And so the same image that was in Ezekiel is sort of utilized in Revelation to talk about the realities of this new creation, this new heaven and new earth, where the river of life that flows from the life of God and gives life and vitality wherever it flows, wherever it touches, is coming down through the middle of this street, and it is available to all to touch, to drink, to be satisfied by its deep waters. And then on each side of the river stands this tree of life. Again, thinking of the story of creation, you shall not take of this tree of good and evil, but you can always eat from the tree of life. And so it sounds like Eden, that the New Jerusalem, whatever it looks like, also has this sort of Eden-like quality. It is kind of like the new garden, the restoration of the garden. All that had been broken in the very first place, and the garden is being restored. And so this tree of life bears 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Now, if you will notice, the tree being on both sides of this river, it means that it is available to everyone. No one is cut off from the tree of life. It's able to be accessed on both sides of the river, so that there are not have and have-nots, but everybody has access to this life. And it is available, it is free for those who would come. And so this beautiful imagery of this kind of new creation reality that has Eden-like qualities, if it is not a new Eden, a restored Eden, but it has Eden-like qualities to it. There's this kind of garden theme that's running throughout. And then it follows it in verse 3 by saying, no longer will there be any curse. Now, if you remember the story in Genesis 3, when the curse appears, the kinds of things that it does is it increases labor pains. That's not to say labor pain wasn't already present in some way. If you work hard in soil, your back aches, all those kinds of things. But it became more difficult for life to flourish in those places. When we planted things, thistles and thorns would choke it out. And bearing a child was not only difficult, but sometimes deadly, especially for those people in pre-medical advances that we have. It was sometimes very deadly and difficult, and all sorts of question marks around it. The labor increased, and not only that, with the curse, it had sort of ripple effects. The ripple effect became this sort of alienation between God and humanity. It became alienation between humanity itself, between the relationship between person to person. And so we began to blame and to shame and to create systems of violence and oppression. If you read that story, especially Genesis 3 through 11, and even 12 to some degree, you get this sense of creation's curse just sort of bubbling over like a really bad disease that has become part of the world, corrupting the world in some manner. And so the curse has been done away with. There's no longer this enmity between God and us, and between our relationships with each other, and even further between us and the creation. So there's this holistic restoration of life, of blessing, of mutuality, of fellowship, and the curse is no more. And then continuing on, the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. So we have this picture of God being served by those who are God's people. And then we also see this relationality, this intimacy. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. Now, if you remember Moses, when he was out in the wilderness, he said, just let me see your face. And God said, you can't do it. If you see my face, you will surely die, because my holiness is too great for you to be able to handle. But here, the transformed humanity is brought back to that kind of garden moment where Adam and Eve walked with God in the cool of the evening, and you get this sense of the intimacy, this sense of connection. And here that connection is restored. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. The name on the foreheads comes from the story in Deuteronomy chapter 6 with the Shema. The Shema says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," and then talks about all the ways that Israel is supposed to live in this new promised land that God is giving them. As Moses is transitioning out of leadership, Joshua is going to be taking them into the promised land. And one of the things that the Shema says in chapter 6, Deuteronomy 6, is that you are to bind my law on your hands and on your forehead. In other words, it's to be constantly on your mind and constantly guiding the things that you do with your hands, how you live, how you work, how you engage with others, how you live in the creation. And here it says his name will be on our foreheads. In other words, we will be marked by the way of the Lamb. We will be marked by this way of God in the world again, kind of like those phylacteries, those boxes that would carry a small part of the Torah, a reminder of the instruction God had given to live as a peculiar, set-apart people in the world. And so here, again, there is this sense of being set apart for God's purposes and living in the world in right relationship with God, with each other, and in the creation itself. There will be no more night. And that's not to say that that's a literal statement. I don't know, maybe it is, but the sense that there is no longer this need for being hidden from one another. That shame that we often hide and disguise, that doesn't allow others to see all our foibles and brokenness, that's no longer needed. We no longer need to walk in the night as if to hide from our shame, but rather to be exposed by the light, to be brought into this place of where shame is not a reality and hiddenness is no longer reality, but we are able to be freely open with one another. And they will not need the lamp or the sun, for the Lord God will give them light, and they will reign forever and ever. On this last note, on they will reign forever and ever, I think we need to also be careful in how we talk about this. The reality is sometimes we think about going to heaven and having crowns of thorn, crowns of victory and all that. That it's sort of like we have dominated the world, we've beaten the world, and we've overcome, and we are the conquerors. And we use this sort of very violent language to talk about the coming of the kingdom. But here, they will reign forever and ever should be qualified by what is said in verse 3. His servants will serve him. The way that humanity will reign will not be by overtaking it, by conquering it, by dominating it, but rather by serving God, serving one another, and being good stewards of the creation, not destroying the world, but allowing it, helping it to have this new vitality, fruitfulness, and blessing. In other words, we are not then to just become dominating kinds of people. And sometimes the way that we talk about the eschaton, the way that we talk about the new heaven and new earth and sort of escaping out of this world, we don't really recognize that we are to live in the world right now, that the kingdom of this world has become the kingdom of our God. And already in this time, we are to live as those who reign, not as overlords, but those who have followed the way of Jesus, the sacrificial lamb, the one who has given up his life for the sake of the world. We are to then pattern our lives after the lamb and serve God by serving others and serving the world. And in that way, we find that even in the midst of the dead places in our world currently, that new small pockets of hope begin to arise, that the kingdom can be said to be here, now, and present because God's presence is made manifest through the testimony of God's people. That is the foundation of the hope that we are part of. That is the foundation that is being built as this new world is being brought into reality, as God is slowly, ever so slowly, but ever so surely, transforming the world and preparing it for this new kingdom, this new creation that God is unfolding even now. May God bless you and keep you. Hope that the rest of your week will be a blessing. If you have any questions or things that were unclear that you would like answered about this particular passage, anything like that, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to have a conversation with you. Have a blessed week.